4 living children sold for the husband's debts. A Lakota chief brought 3 of them back. The paper was in my hand before I understood what it said. I had ridden down to Tuttle's trading post for axle grease and 2 pounds of dried corn, nothing more, and Tuttle had handed me that paper the way a man hands you something he doesn't want to touch. Said a writer had left it the day before. Said the writer didn't give a name. It was a bill of sale, in English and badly in what someone thought was Lakota. 4 children, ages listed as 11, 9, 7, and 4. Names I did not recognize. Payment received in settlement of debts accrued by one Mr. Harlan Cope, deceased, to one Mr. Emmett Drood of Crow Creek. I folded the paper and put it in my coat pocket, and paid Tuttle for the corn and the grease and rode home. I did not sleep that night. Not because I was troubled in the way a man is troubled by something he cannot solve. I knew what it meant. I knew Emmett Drood, knew his operation on Crow Creek, the kind of place that calls itself a labor settlement and takes in the desperate and the indebted and does not let them go easy. Knew he had a reach that went as far south as the Republican River and as far east as the Missouri crossings, and that he collected what was owed to him in whatever currency was available. What kept me up was simpler than all of that. It was the number 4, 4 children. And somewhere on the wrong side of that bill of sale was a woman who had just lost all 4 of them. I got up before light and went to find her. Her name was Margaret Cope, and she was living in what had been the Harlan Cope homestead, a poor claim, badly situated, the kind of ground a man takes when all the better ground is gone. A 1-room soddy with a patched roof and a linta for 2 mules that were no longer there. The mules would have been part of the settlement too. She came to the door before I knocked. She must have heard the horse. She was maybe 35, maybe older. Grief does something to a face that makes age hard to read. Her hair was down, and she was wearing her husband's coat over her own dress. She looked at me the way people look when they have been expecting bad news and have run out of the capacity to be surprised by it. I am not a man who speaks before he knows what he wants to say. Some men fill silence with words. I never have. I stood on her step in the gray morning and said, "I have a paper." She said, "I know about the paper." I said, "Where were they taken?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at me for a long moment, not with suspicion exactly, but with something measured in it, the way a person looks when they are deciding whether the thing in front of them is what it appears to be. Then she stepped aside and let me in. The house was cold. She hadn't lit the stove yet. There was a tin cup on the table and a Bible with a broken spine and nothing else that I could see. The children's things, whatever there had been of them, were already gone. Drood's men would have come through and taken what could be sold. She told me what she knew, which wasn't much. Drood had sent 2 men with the paper and a county official who stood outside and didn't look at her while the other 2 went through the house. She'd been told it was lawful. She'd been told there was nothing to contest. She'd been told that Harlan Cope's debts were considerable, and that the children would be cared for and put to honest labor, and that she should be grateful for the county's forbearance in not pressing charges against her as well. She said all of this very flatly, like a woman reading from a page. When she was done, I said, "Which direction did they go?" She said south and east, toward the river. I said, "Is there a 4th child you have not mentioned?" Something moved across her face then. Not grief. She was past the acute edge of that, I think, by the time I found her. Something more like a wound that has been touched. She said, "Clara, she's 4. They took her first, a separate party the day before. Drood sold her separately, I don't know to who." I said, "All right." She said, "Mr." and stopped. She didn't know my name. In her position, I would not have asked it either. I said, "Tall Bear, that's what the whites call me. My name in Lakota is longer." She said, "Mr. Tall Bear." I said, "I will bring back what I can bring back." I said it the way I would say anything that I meant plainly, not to give comfort, because comfort was not what I could honestly offer, but because it was true and she deserved to hear true things. She looked at me for a long moment and then she said, "Why?" I thought about that. It was a fair question. I said, "Because that paper was given to me and not to someone else, and I can read it." That was not the whole of it, but it was enough. I am 54 years old. I have been called a chief by people who do not entirely understand what that means and by people who do, and the difference between those two groups of people matters a great deal to me. A chief is not a king. A chief is a man who carries the weight of the people around him because he has the back for it, and because no one else stepped forward, and because stepping forward is what you do when the weight is there and you can lift it. My father was such a man. His father before him. I do not know if I am such a man yet. I know what I have done and what I have failed to do, and the accounting between those two columns is still running. I had taken a wife once, 20 years before. She died in the second winter of our son, from a fever that took 3 people in our camp that season. The boy, I named him Running Elk, though the whites called him George for reasons I never fully parsed, grew up quiet and capable, and he was working cattle now on a ranch north of the Niobrara, and I saw him twice a year, and that was its own kind of grief, but a manageable one. The kind that becomes part of how you breathe. I say this not to make the story about me, but because you need to understand the man riding south toward Crow Creek. Not a young man. Not a man with illusions. A man who knew what Emmett Drood's operation was because he had ridden past it twice and smelled it. The way you smell something wrong before you see it, wood smoke and unwashed bodies, and something else beneath that. Something that has no name but that every man recognizes. I rode with my rifle across my saddle and my pistol on my belt and 2 days' food in my saddlebag and the paper in my coat pocket. I did not bring help. I should have, perhaps. I have thought about that since. But bringing help takes time, and time was not something those children had in quantity. The land south of the White River in that season was flat and pale, the grass gone to straw, the sky a particular shade of gray that means cold without snow, the wind out of the northwest at a steady, miserable angle. I knew the country. I had hunted it when I was young and ridden it on business and ridden it on the kind of errand that has no good name. I knew where the crossings were, and where the bad ground was, and where a man could push a horse at night without risking a leg. I rode through the first night, stopped before dawn to rest the horse and eat and sleep 2 hours in a hollow with my back against a cut bank, and my coat pulled up. The ground was cold enough to stiffen my hands when I woke. I built a very small fire for the heat of it, nothing you'd see from 50 yards, and warmed my hands and broke ice in the creek to water the horse and started again. I reached Crow Creek the following afternoon. Drood's place was built in stages. You could see it in the construction. What had been a trading post at one end, then a long bunkhouse added perpendicular, then a series of outbuildings that didn't relate to each other in any sensible way. The whole thing had the character of a place that had grown without planning, which is not always a bad thing in a building, but is usually a bad thing in an operation. There were 8 or 10 men that I could see from the rise above the creek, workers, or what Drood called workers, moving between the outbuildings and the bunkhouse with the particular shuffle of people who have stopped expecting things to get better. There was a cook fire outside, a woman tending it middle-aged, her face hidden by her hair. No children visible. That didn't mean they weren't there. I rode down the slope at a pace that was not hurried but was not tentative either. I have learned that how you arrive at a place like that matters enormously. You arrive too fast, men reach for guns. You arrive too slow, men decide you're afraid. You arrive like you have an appointment and a right to be there, and most men will let you walk very far before they think to question it. A man came out of the trading post building when I was 30 yards out. Big man, red-faced, with a coat that had seen better winters. He had his hand near his belt but not on it. He said, "This is private property." I said, "I know it. I'm looking for Emmett Drood." He said, "What for?" I said, "Business." He looked me over. He was doing the calculation that men do, weighing how much trouble I represented against how much trouble turning me away might cause. I was one man on a horse. But I was also Lakota in a coat that cost more than his, riding a horse that was clearly better than anything in Drood's corral, and I had not flinched when he came out. The calculation took a moment. He said, "Wait here." He went inside. I did not wait where he told me to. I moved the horse sideways to a position where I could see both the front door and the bunkhouse and the main outbuilding, and nothing could come at me from behind. Old habit, old enough that I don't think about it anymore. Drood came out about 5 minutes later. He was a smaller man than I expected, thin, pale, with the precise and careful way of moving that belongs to men who have survived by being smarter than the people around them and know it. He wore a good coat. His boots were clean. His eyes went over me the way a merchant goes over a piece of goods. He said, "Tall bear." He knew me. That was interesting. I said, "Drood." He said, "You're a long way from your people." I said, "I have a paper." I took it out and held it so he could see it without coming close. "This paper names 4 children of Harlan Cope. I'm here about 3 of them." He said, "Those children are the lawful settlement of a debt." I said, "I didn't say they weren't. I said I'm here about 3 of them." I reached into my coat and took out a folded paper of my own, not a legal document, just a figure written on paper, but I held it the same way you'd hold something that mattered. "I'm prepared to pay." He said, "They're not for sale." I said, "Everything at Crow Creek is for sale, Mr. Drood. I have ridden past this place twice in the last 4 years, and I know what it is. Name a figure." Something shifted in his face. Not offense. Men like Drood don't get offended by the truth about their operations, because acknowledging the truth would require acknowledging that there is something to be offended about, and Drood had long since passed that point. What shifted was the calculation. He was deciding if I had money and if I had backup, and if this was going to be clean. I let him decide. I did not fill the silence. He said, "The eldest is earning her keep in the kitchen. The boy works the stock. The 7-year-old is," he paused, which told me the 7-year-old was somewhere he didn't want to name out loud. "The arrangement is established." I said, "Disestablish it. Name a figure for 3. He said, "Why 3? I said, "Because the 4th was already sold on separately. I know that and you know that. I'm not here to waste your time or mine." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he named a figure that was almost certainly 3 times what he'd have taken, and I did not negotiate because I was not in a position to negotiate and because he probably knew that too. I paid it. I paid it in currency I had taken from a tin box under my floor before I left, the kind of money a man keeps for emergencies. This qualified. He took the money and counted it, and then he called for the red-faced man and spoke quietly to him, and the man went into the bunkhouse. They came out 10 minutes later with 3 children. I need to tell you about those 10 minutes, because they matter. I sat on my horse in the yard of Emmett Drood's place, and I watched his men move around me, and I thought about all the things that could go wrong, and I thought about the paper in my pocket, and whether it would mean anything in a county court if it came to that, and I thought about the woman in the cold house and the Bible with the broken spine. I thought about my son north of the Niobrara and how old I was, and how cold the ground had been that morning. I did not think about fear exactly. Fear is not the right word for what I carry into situations like that. It is more like a very sharp attention to everything around you. The way a man who has done something enough times stops feeling his own heartbeat and starts feeling the air. The red-faced man came back with the 3 children. The eldest was a girl, probably 11, with her mother's face and the particular stillness of a child who has learned in the last several days that stillness is safer than movement. The boy was 9, and he was trying very hard not to cry and doing a decent job of it. The youngest of the 3 was 7, a girl, and she was not trying at all. She was crying silently. the way children cry when they have cried so much that the noise has gone out of it. The elder girl looked at me and said, in a voice that was steadier than it had any right to be, "Are you here for us?" I said, "I am." She said, "My mother sent you." I said, "Not exactly, but I know where your mother is and that's where we're going." She took her brother's hand. She put her free hand on the shoulder of the 7-year-old. She looked at Drew, not at me, and she said nothing to him at all, which struck me as the correct response. I looked at Drew. I said, "The fourth child, the one sold separately, where?" He said, "That's not part of our arrangement." I said, "I know it isn't, I'm asking." He said, "A family in Yankton, I don't know the name." I said, "Yes, you do." He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said a name. I don't know if it was the right name, but it was a name. I put it in my memory next to the figure of a 4-year-old girl named Clara, and I turned the horse north. The ride back was 3 days because I could not push the horse the way I had coming down. 3 children on one horse is not practical. The boy rode with me and the girls walked, and I walked too except on the worst ground. We moved slowly. The elder girl, her name was Alice, I learned, did not complain once. The boy, who was called James, complained twice and then stopped when I didn't respond to it. The 7-year-old, Nora, cried off and on for the first day, and then seemed to make a decision somewhere in the middle of the second afternoon and stopped. I fed them from my saddlebag, which ran out at midday on the second day. After that, I shot a rabbit at dusk, and we ate it with the last of the dried corn, and slept around a fire I built in the shelter of a dry creek bed. Alice sat across the fire from me that night, and watched me with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a thing she doesn't have enough information to understand yet. She said, "You're a chief." I said, "So they tell me." She said, "Did you come because it was the right thing to do?" I thought about that. I said, "I came because I could." Whether that's the same as the right thing, I leave to other men to decide. She said, "My mother doesn't have any money to pay you back." I said, "I know that." She said, "Then why did you pay for us?" I said, "Because the paper was given to me. I told your mother that." She was quiet for a while, then she said, "That's a strange reason." I said, "Yes, it is." She thought about that and then she lay down and pulled her coat over herself and went asleep with one arm around Nora and one hand on James's ankle, and I sat with the fire and watched the dark and thought about nothing in particular, which is a state I have learned to cultivate in the years since my wife died. Thinking about nothing in particular is different from peace. It is more like the eye of something, a still place surrounded by motion. We came in sight of the Cope homestead in the middle of the third afternoon, and Margaret Cope saw us from a long way off. She must have been watching. She came out of the house at a walk that was almost a run but not quite, the way people move when they do not trust what they see and cannot bring themselves to go slower. She stopped 10 yards from us and looked at her children the way a woman looks when she is counting. 1, 2, 3. And then her face went through something that I don't have words for, something that moved from relief to grief so fast the two things seemed to occupy the same moment. Because she was counting and she came up one short. She knew she would. But knowing a thing and seeing the confirmation of it are different experiences, and what crossed her face then was that difference, played out in about 3 seconds. Alice walked to her mother. The other two followed. Margaret Cope put her arms around all 3 of them at once and held them and said nothing at all. I waited. My horse stamped once and dropped her head to work at a patch of dry grass near the step. After a while Margaret Cope looked up at me over Alice's shoulder. She said, "Clara." I said, "A family in Yankton, I have a name. I'll send word through the agency." I stopped. She didn't need to know how. "I'll find her." She said, "You don't have to do that." I said, "I know." She stood there holding her children and she looked at me, and I think she understood right then that there was not a promise being made, not the kind you make to be kind, not the kind that means I have done all I am willing to do and here is where it ends. I think she understood that I meant the simple thing I said. I would find the child. She said, "You rode 4 days for 3 children you'd never met." I said 3.5, counting the first night. She almost smiled, not quite, but almost. She said, "Will you stay tonight? I haven't much, but I can feed you." I looked at the house and the cold steppe and the sky going orange in the west, and I said I would. She had dried beans and cornmeal and a half jar of preserved peaches that she opened for the children and made them eat even though they said they weren't hungry, which was not true. We ate around the table, all 5 of us, me at one end and her at the other and the children between us. And it was the quietest meal I have eaten in recent memory and also one of the most orderly, because Alice ran that table the way a woman 10 years older would have. After the children were asleep on the floor by the stove, wrapped in every blanket in the house, Margaret Cope and I sat with what was left of the coffee and were quiet for a while. She said, "My husband was not a bad man." I said, "I didn't say he was." She said, "He was bad with money." "There's a difference." She looked at the cup in her hands. "He borrowed from Drood twice. The second time he couldn't pay, and then he got sick, and then he died, and Drood came with his paper." I said, "I know how that works." She said, "Do you think Clara is all right?" I said, 4 years old, sold to a family in Yankton. If it was the name Drood gave me, they're respectable people. Not wealthy, but respectable. She's likely warm and fed." She said, "Likely." I said, "Yes, likely." She appreciated that, I think. Not the comfort of it, there was no comfort in it, but the honesty. She struck me as a woman who had been lied to kindly for a good portion of her life, and was past the point where kind lies helped. She said, "How will you find her?" I said, "The Indian Agency in Rosebud has a man who knows the Yankton area well. He owes me a favor. I'll send him the name and he'll ride out and confirm she's where I think she is. Then," I stopped, "then I'll go get her." She looked at me across the table. The lamplight was low and it caught the lines around her eyes, the ones that are not from age but from worry, the kind that set in during a bad year and never leave. She said, "You're going to spend your own money on a family you don't know." I said, "I already did." She said, "I can't repay you." I said, "I didn't ask you to." She said, "Then what do you want?" It was a direct question, and she asked it directly without flinching, and I respected that. I thought about how to answer it honestly. I said, "I want nothing that you owe me. That's the honest answer." I looked at my cup. What I want and what I'm owed are different things. What I want is for those children to be in one house. What I want is to find the 4th one and bring her back. That's all. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Why?" And I said the same thing I'd said to Alice, because it was still the truest answer I had. Because I could, and because the paper was given to me. She said, "That's going to bother me for a while." I said, "It's supposed to. It's not a complete answer. But it's an honest one." She stood up and went to the stove and turned it down for the night and checked the children and stood there for a moment with her back to me, looking at them. Then she turned and said, "You should sleep. I'll make a place." She made a place on the floor near the fire with the second best blanket, which was not a very good blanket, and she said good night and went behind the curtain that separated the room from what served as her sleeping area. I lay down on that floor and listened to the children breathe and the fire settle and the wind work at the corner of the roof, and I felt something that I don't have a common word for. Not happiness exactly, not satisfaction, something more like, the weight is in the right place. The thing you were built to carry is on your back, where it belongs. I fell asleep fast and slept hard, and that is its own kind of answer. I went back to find Clara in December, when the ground was frozen and the sky was the white of old bone. The name Drood had given me was Enright. Silas Enright and his wife Edna, A farm couple on the eastern edge of the Yankton Sioux Territory. No children of their own. Respectable in the way Drood had said, plain people. Church-going, with a solid house and a wood supply that suggested they planned ahead. My man at the agency had confirmed they were there. Confirmed Clara was there. Confirmed she was fed and clothed and that the Enrights were not unkind. He said that last part twice, which I took to mean there was something complicated in it. I rode to their farm and knocked on the door, and a woman answered, thin, careful, with the look of someone who has wanted a child a long time and finally has one, and is not at all sure about the man on her step. I told her who I was and why I was there. She did not say anything for a long moment. She turned and called her husband, and he came to the door, a big man, older, with a red beard going gray. He looked at me and then looked past me at the horse and the cold open land behind me. He said, "Is she in trouble, the child?" I said, "No, her mother is alive and wants her home." He said, "We paid for her legal." I said, "I know. I'm prepared to pay you back what you paid and something besides." The woman made a sound that was not quite a word. Not protest, not grief, something in between. I said, "The child's name is Clara Cope. She has a mother named Margaret and a sister named Alice and two more, James and Nora. She was taken from them to settle a debt her dead father left. That's the situation. I'm not here to say you did anything wrong." The man looked at his wife. She was looking at the floor. He said, "Edna." She said very quietly, "I knew this would come." There was a long silence. Then the woman stepped back from the door and called into the house, and a small girl came to the doorway. 4 years old, dark-haired, with the Cope face that I had now seen on 3 people and recognized immediately on a 4th. She looked at me without fear, which surprised me. Then she said to the woman, "Is it time?" The woman said, "Yes, baby, it's time." I don't know what she meant by that. I have thought about it since, and I don't know if she had told the child her mother was looking for her, or if the child had simply known in the way children sometimes know things. What I know is that Clara walked to the door and stood next to the woman and put her hand in the woman's hand, and the woman held it for a moment and then let it go. I paid Silas Enright what he asked. He did not try to take advantage of me on the price. We shook hands, and I put Clara on the horse in front of me, and we rode. She did not speak for the first hour. She sat in front of me on the saddle with her hands on the pommel and looked at the land going past. Then she said, "Is Alice going to be there?" I said, "Yes." She said, "And James and Nora?" I said, "All of them." She said, "And Mama?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Okay." And that was the end of that conversation. She leaned back against me slightly, not much, just enough to take some of the cold off her front, and I rode north with a 4-year-old child asleep against my chest by mid-afternoon, her breath small and even, her weight less than you'd think. That was January, 18 months ago now. I have been back to the Cope place 4 times since then. Not always with a reason, and not always welcomed with anything more than coffee and a plate of whatever was on the stove. But welcomed. That is the word. I have helped them through 2 hard stretches, once with food when the garden failed, once with a loan that has not been repaid and likely won't be, and that I don't think about in those terms. I have chopped their firewood twice when the cold came early and Harlan Cope's axe had been taken with the rest. Alice is 12 now and runs that house like she was born doing it. James is 10 and already has the kind of steadiness that most men don't find until their 40s. Nora has stopped crying all the time. Clara has started talking a great deal, which seems to be her natural state. Margaret Cope and I do not talk about most things directly. We talk about the children and the land and the weather and what the spring looks like for the crop. And sometimes we sit in silence that has stopped being uncomfortable somewhere along the line without either of us noting the moment it happened. She is a practical woman, not cold but practical. She does not confuse things with each other. She does not, for instance, confuse gratitude with something else or obligation with choice. I respect that about her more than I can say. Last fall, after the harvest and before the first hard freeze, she came out to where I was working on the fence line along her east boundary, a section that had been badly done to begin with and had finally given up entirely, and she brought coffee and stood there while I worked. After a while she said, "I want you to stop." I stopped working and looked at her. She said, "I want you to stop coming out here and fixing things and riding away." I said, "All right." She said, "That's not what I mean." She looked at the fence post I'd been setting, then she looked at me. "I mean I want you to stop riding away." I set the post driver down. I looked at her for a long moment. She said, "I'm not asking you to take us on as a burden. I know what we are. I know what you've already given. I'm not." She stopped. "I'm asking you to consider whether there's something here worth staying for." I thought about it. I thought about the floor by the fire and the weight in the right place and the children's breathing and the particular silence of that house at night, which is its own kind of sound. I said, "I've been considering it." She said, "And?" I said, "I think there might be." She did not reach for me, and I did not reach for her. We stood on opposite sides of the fence line she owned and I'd been repairing, and she said, "The children would be pleased." I said, "What about their mother?" And she looked at me straight, with the same directness she'd brought to every hard question since the morning I showed up on her step with a paper, and she said, "Their mother is the one who asked." There's a thing that happens when you've been alone a long time that you stop noticing until it stops. A kind of quiet inside you that you have organized your whole life around, not because you chose it, but because it was what was available. You build around it the way you'd build around a stone in the middle of your field, not moving the stone, just working the rows on either side of it, year after year, until you can't quite remember what the field would look like without it. I have been alone since my wife died 20 years ago. I have worked the rows on either side of that stone so long that I thought the stone was the field. It is not. I am staying on the Cope place through the winter. Come spring, if things are as they appear to be, I will have a conversation with Margaret about what that means in more permanent terms. She will say what she means plainly, as she always does, and I will say what I mean plainly, because that is the only way I know how to say anything, and we will arrive at whatever we arrive at without confusion about the nature of the arrangement. Last week Alice came in from the barn and found me at the table with a cup of coffee, and she sat down across from me and said, without preamble, "Are you going to marry my mother?" I said, "We haven't discussed it yet." She said, "You should discuss it." I said, "Thank you for the advice." She said, "She has been less sad since you started staying. I'm just telling you that." I said, "I know." She said, "And you're less," she paused, looking for the word something. "You're less something too." I said, "Probably." She thought about that and then went back to the barn, and I sat with my coffee and the sound of the house around me, Nora's voice somewhere, and Clara's answer, and James's heavier step on the boards overhead where he sleeps, and the cold outside pressing against the walls. The weight is in the right place. That is all I know how to say about it. The weight is in the right place, and a good woman looked at me and asked me to stop riding away, and I am not riding away. That will have to do for an ending. That's the honest one.